back to Apocalypse here as we continue on with another in brief video. We talked about a few videos ago how the account of Jews and Judaism that is premised on the logic of a movement from box A, characterized by works of law in a sort of legalistic way, to box B, which is characterized by something like faith alone, suggests that there's something about Judaism that self-evidently collapses and that needs to be erased in order for the Christian gospel to be established. Okay. And we learned that that is a very unfair and inaccurate account of Jews and Judaism in Paul's gospel. But we're going to need to give an account of how Paul actually views Israel. If it's not this way that's basically all about erasure, what is it? If God is faithful, we would expect the culmination of God's plan in Jesus to be in strong continuity with what God has been up to prior to his arrival. Now, I mentioned my response to Nick Quint's brief introduction to Apocalyptic Paul, that the idea that there is no continuity in the apocalyptic reading is just wrong. And this is why. Because we're going to need to give an account of the continuity of Israel's story and history. Once Jesus arrives, we would not expect a new plan or an entirely new chosen people to form out of the blue. This is a mistake that many people have made and continue to make. I'm assuming you've heard this sort of form of the gospel preached, where God's initial plan with Israel failed because Israel disobeyed God. So God then turns around and punishes them out of his sort of just wrath and moves on to make a new plan with Christians who would end up at the center of it all. So the church becomes a sort of replacement of Israel. Right? It triumphs faithfully, and Israel sort of fades away as a distant memory of an ancient divine plan that went wrong. And this is what we call supersessionism. And it would obviously call into question God's constancy as well as the integrity of Paul's thinking. It does seem, though, that Paul runs the risk of committing such an error, considering that pagan converts joining God's people in history aren't joining in a way that it's been sort of traditionally organized. What I mean by that is that they're not expected to become Jewish, right? This does look quite strange. So in order to handle all of this, Paul retells the story of Israel retrospectively. Israel's past, as he narrates it, is a beautifully continuous narrative now that the figure to which everything has slowly been building has been revealed. In the light of the climactic event of Jesus being raised from the dead, Paul sees faithfulness in resurrection inscribed into the very heart of Israel's covenantal story from its inception. Israel began when it was called into existence through Abraham's family. So God makes promises to Abraham that his offspring will flourish, and God reiterates this promise as well. But by Paul's day, these promises to Abraham had been interpreted in terms of entry into the age to come. All of Abraham's children would be blessed with this new life and the inheritance of this perfect new world. But there was a technical problem. Abraham and his wife Sarah had no direct heir to carry things forward. At a very old age, having soldiered on with unwavering faith for several years, after the last promises, God miraculously gifted the conception of Isaac, an heir through whom Abraham's seed would descend and the promises be fulfilled. And Paul describes Abraham's old loins and Sarah's barren womb as dead. So the conception and birth of Isaac were literally an event of life from the dead. So resurrection. That's why Paul now sees in the light of Jesus' resurrection being inscribed into the heart of this story. Note now what account of Judaism Paul has constructed over against the sort of box A, which collapses works of law stuff, where you transfer from that into box B. The basic story has God placed centrally as the key character, which of course makes sense, and God calls Judaism into being through its original ancestors, and then promises them future life, right? In this way, God elects or chooses them. God initiates his relationship and gives Israel its existence and purpose. Abraham responds faithfully to this relationship after his call, trusting God. God then fulfills God's original promises in an act of resurrection in Isaac that breaks open the door to new life. Although this is only a foreshadow of the main event that will come at the end of the age. In just this way, God also calls Isaac and then Jacob, providing them with seed and inheritance as well. In view of these origins and the patriarchs and matriarchs of the ancient tradition, Paul can now see how natural it is for Jesus to arrive in the world as God incarnate, the one who comes to definitively open the doorway into the promised new life through his resurrection. He is a new faithful figure who has endured suffering and waiting and has been given new life through resurrection. And in him, the age to come is not merely anticipated, but is now present in some sense in our reality. The promises to Abraham have been fulfilled in Jesus. Paul also finds the basis for his own missionary work to the pagans in this story about Israel. God has promised Abraham that he will be the father of many nations, and this means the pagan nations, okay? God tells Abraham time and time again, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. So Paul's mission to the pagan nations is really the result of this prior blessing in history. The pagans have also gained access to the life of the age to come through Abraham's most important descendant, Jesus. The surprising aspect of this, though, is that pagans can participate in this new reality without fully adopting Jewish practices. The broader inclusion of pagans into this new resurrected age is in amazing continuity with what has always been foreshadowed in the story of Abraham and his family. And God has done just this, because God is free to include in the new age whomever God wishes, all the while remaining unwaveringly committed to his original people, Israel. This is, of course, not an uncontroversial re-narration of Judaism's past. Paul has really defined Israel in terms of its patriarchal and matriarchal origins specifically, and he seems to have decentered, in a way, national narratives of the Exodus and the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, more than many Jews of his day would have. This is likely because, as we have already talked about, God's gift of Torah is kind of a double-edged sword. So Paul's history of Jewish origins depicts the gift of Torah, which he suggests does remain a good gift, as I talked about in the last video, as a sort of interlude within a larger symphony of patriarchal promises and their later fulfillment in the arrival, death, and resurrection of the Messiah, with its negative dimension drawn predominantly from the story of Adam. But what does Paul think about the vast majority of Israel who do not presently confess Christ's lordship? What about non-believing Israel? We need to be emphatically clear that the Jewish people are still very much God's people. This does not go away. They are first and foremost the people to whom God came in person. Moreover, Jesus, a resurrected Jewish person, is now the rationale for all of humanity who now populate the new resurrected age. Israel will always be the tree trunk of the church. Converts from paganism are included as unnatural additions to the Jewish tradition. They are honorary guests, or we are honorary guests, welcomed into this ancient story that was not originally ours. We owe an incalculable debt to Judaism because of this. And we Gentiles cannot just lay claim to what is not ours, okay? It is especially horrifying to think, then, that instead of acknowledging this, Christians have historically negated Jewish people in all sorts of ways, erasing their practices and identity, judging them as inferior, immoral, irrational, and, of course, eventually, what happens? Kidnapping and sending them to camps for enslavement and execution. But Paul viewed all Israel as privileged and irreducibly special, which was a fundamentally Christ-centered position for him. It was rooted in the most powerful revelation of God that Paul knew and loved. God's commitment to Israel is irrevocable, unconditional, and fundamentally positive, too. God has elected Israel and has promised to be their God forever, a promise that has been made manifest in the person of Jesus. God does not let go of or give up on Israel, even when they're not responding to Christ. And this is extremely important to hang on to, okay? We're going to talk about this more in coming videos, about the implications of this for the future. However, one could object at this point and say, I think I can think of harsh judgment texts in Paul that suggest that God is, at the end of the day, conditional and contractual. You have to actually do certain things to be a member of God's people and be guaranteed resurrection to new life, regardless of if you're a Messianic Jew or a pagan Christian. At the end of the day, you need to believe in Jesus. If you don't, then it sure seems like you're going to be judged and excluded from the age to come. This seems to be what Paul thinks about judgment, right? Not everyone's included. It seems like non-believing Jews in particular get excluded from God's people eventually, along with all other unbelieving people. To this objection, we're going to need to move to discuss Paul's understanding of Judaism's future, which will help reveal that these objections can be sufficiently addressed. So that's where we'll be headed in the next couple of videos. If you have any questions about this video, please put them down in the comments section. Please like and subscribe to the channel. And with that, this has been Apocalypse here, Christianity you can live with.